There is an island in Europe where, until the year 2008, the law was still effectively decided by one man, a system that hadn't fundamentally changed since Queen Elizabeth I was on the throne. No election, no parliament in any modern sense, just 40 families and one hereditary ruler, running an entire island almost exactly as their ancestors had for 443 years. And what finally ended, it wasn't a revolution. It was two of the richest brothers in Britain and a lawsuit. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how that happened. Let's take a closer look. This is Sark, a Crown Dependency in the Channel Islands, barely 3 miles long, sitting almost exactly halfway between England and France. It has no cars, no airport, no streetlights at night. And for 443 years, it had no democracy either. Stay with me until the end, because the way this changed involves one of the strangest legal battles in modern British history. And it's a story almost nobody outside these islands actually knows. Sark's modern history begins in 1565, when a nobleman from the neighboring island of Jersey named Helier de Carteret petitioned Queen Elizabeth I for the right to settle it. The island had been essentially uninhabited and vulnerable to pirate raids, and Elizabeth granted de Carteret a charter on one specific condition. He had to bring 40 men to permanently colonize and defend the island against the Crown's enemies. De Carteret did exactly that, dividing Sark into 40 parcels of land called tenements, one for each of the families he brought with him. In exchange for this grant, de Carteret became the island's first seigneur, its feudal lord, holding Sark directly from the English monarch, obligated to pay the Crown a token annual fee for the privilege. What made this arrangement so unusual wasn't simply that it existed. Feudal systems were common enough across 16th century Europe. What made Sark different is that this exact structure, with only incremental modifications, continued functioning largely intact for the next 4.5 centuries. The 40 original tenements remained the basis of representation on the island's governing body, called the Chief Pleas, for generation after generation, long after every comparable system anywhere else in Western Europe had been dismantled, reformed, or swept away entirely. Sark's isolation only reinforced how little pressure there ever was to change. Even the 20th century's upheavals mostly passed the island by, with one dramatic exception. During the Second World War, German forces occupied Sark in 1940, along with the other Channel Islands, and did not leave until the island's liberation in May 1945. Even that occupation, extraordinary as it was, didn't fundamentally alter the feudal structure underneath it. Sark's seigneur remained in place throughout, and the old system resumed almost exactly as it had been once the war ended. Understanding how that system actually worked, day to day, for 4 centuries, is where this story goes next. Until 2008, Sark's government was called the Chief Pleas, and it looked almost nothing like a modern parliament. Its members weren't elected by the island's residents. They were the 40 tenants, the landholders descended from or who had purchased, one of the original 40 tenements de Carteret had established in 1565, sitting essentially by hereditary or property right, not by any popular vote. Presiding over all of it was the seigneur, a position passed down through inheritance since the 16th century, holding the island directly from the British Crown. The seigneur appointed a seneschal to actually chair chief pleas meetings and serve as the island's judge, and held real functioning authority over the island's laws, including, remarkably, laws governing property, inheritance, and even personal matters like divorce, which was prohibited on Sark for most of its history. This wasn't some symbolic, ceremonial holdover either. The seigneur's feudal privileges were genuinely economically significant. Historically, the seigneur received a portion of the proceeds whenever land on the island changed hands, along with other feudal dues collected from tenants. A system of real, ongoing financial power tied directly to a title inherited rather than earned. For over 400 years, this arrangement simply continued, largely unquestioned, on an island small and isolated enough that almost nobody outside it had reason to challenge how it was run. What eventually forced the issue wasn't internal unrest from Sark's own 600 residents. It came from somewhere far more modern and far more unexpected, which is exactly where we're headed after we talk about what actually keeps this tiny island economically afloat today. Sark's modern economy runs overwhelmingly on tourism, drawing visitors specifically attracted by the very things that make the island unusual. The complete absence of cars, the unhurried pace of life, and since 2011, its status as the world's first officially designated dark sky island, recognized for genuinely unpolluted night skies free of the light pollution that affects nearly everywhere else in Western Europe. With no airstrip and no cars, nearly every visitor arrives the same way, a roughly 45-minute ferry crossing from Guernsey, and finds an island whose accommodations, restaurants, and shops exist almost entirely to serve that steady, seasonal tourist trade. The resident population of 500 to 600 can swell to close to 1,000 during peak summer months, a seasonal economy that shapes employment and income across the island. Sark has also long had a reputation as a low-tax jurisdiction, historically attractive to wealthy individuals and companies for its favorable tax status as a Crown Dependency outside the United Kingdom and the European Union, a reputation that, as we'll see shortly, became directly relevant to the very forces that eventually ended the island's feudal system. For ordinary residents, though, daily economic life on Sark is considerably more modest. Small-scale agriculture, fishing, hospitality work, and the kind of service jobs any tourist-dependent economy generates. Land and property here have historically been governed by inheritance rules tied directly to the old tenement system, meaning even something as basic as owning a home on Sark was for centuries entangled with the same feudal structure that governed everything else. And it's exactly that entanglement between land, wealth, and inherited power that set the stage for the conflict that finally changed everything. Step off the ferry on Sark, and the first thing that becomes obvious is what's missing. There are no cars anywhere on the island, and there never have been. The only permitted vehicles are horse-drawn carriages, bicycles, agricultural tractors, and more recently, battery-powered buggies, reserved specifically for elderly or disabled residents who need them. This isn't a tourist gimmick, maintained for atmosphere. It reflects a genuinely different daily rhythm than almost anywhere else in Western Europe. Getting from one side of the island to the other means walking, cycling, or, for visitors and goods, a horse-drawn cart ride up from the harbour. Even the island's ambulance and fire truck have historically operated without conventional engines, relying on tractor-drawn equipment instead. At night, that difference becomes even more pronounced. Sark has no streetlights at all, a fact that, combined with minimal other light pollution, is precisely what earned it the world's first dark sky island designation in 2011. Residents and visitors alike can, on a clear night, see the Milky Way directly overhead in a way that's become genuinely rare almost anywhere else in Europe. It's a pace of life that residents consistently describe as the island's defining quality, not backwardness, but a deliberate, sustained choice to remain exactly as unhurried as Sark has always been. And that same resistance to change is precisely what made the political battle brewing beneath the surface over exactly who should hold power on this island so consequential when it finally erupted. In the 1990s, two identical twin brothers named Sir Frederick and Sir David Barclay, British billionaires who had built a media and business empire that would eventually include the Telegraph newspaper, purchased the small neighboring island of Breccu, just off Sark's coast, and built an enormous private castle there. What followed was, by any measure, one of the strangest legal and political conflicts in recent British history. The Barclay brothers began acquiring property on Sark itself, eventually controlling a meaningful share of the island's businesses and land. And they didn't stop there. They pursued a sustained legal campaign, including human rights challenges specifically targeting Sark's feudal electoral system, arguing that a government where representation was tied to hereditary land tenure rather than popular vote was fundamentally incompatible with modern human rights law. Their case had real legal teeth. The European Convention on Human Rights, which the United Kingdom and its Crown Dependencies were obligated to uphold, guaranteed the right to free and fair elections, a standard Sark's unelected, land-based chief pleas simply did not meet by any conventional modern legal standard. The pressure worked, though not without years of political conflict, competing lawsuits, and considerable local resentment toward what many Sark residents saw as outside billionaires attempting to reshape their island's centuries-old identity for their own commercial advantage. Whatever the underlying motives, the outcome was undeniable. The same forces that had kept Sark's feudal system intact for over 4 centuries finally gave way, and it's exactly how that happened that this entire video has been building toward. Reaching Sark today requires the same basic route it always has. First, a flight or ferry to Guernsey, one of the larger and better connected Channel Islands, followed by a roughly 45-minute passenger ferry crossing to Sark itself. There is no airstrip on Sark, and aircraft of any kind are prohibited from landing, a restriction that has remained constant even as nearly every other aspect of the island's governance has changed. Once the ferry arrives at Sark's small harbour, visitors are met immediately by the island's defining absence. No taxis, no rental cars, nothing with a combustion engine waiting to take you further. The traditional way up from the harbour to the main village has long been by tractor-drawn transport or on foot, with horse-drawn carriages available for a more leisurely and more expensive alternative. From there, exploring the island itself means walking or cycling along quiet lanes, past the dramatic cliffs and the narrow high isthmus known as La Coupe that connects the main body of Sark to the smaller peninsula called Little Sark. A crossing so narrow and exposed that, in stormy weather, it has historically required handrails simply to cross safely on foot. This deliberate difficulty, no cars, no airport, a proper boat crossing required just to arrive, has functioned for Sark much the way similar isolation has functioned for other islands covered on this channel, filtering out casual, spontaneous visitors and helping preserve a character that mass, effortless tourism tends to erode everywhere else it reaches. A handful of details about Sark tend to surprise people more than anything else about the island. Until relatively recent legal reforms, divorce was not permitted under Sark law at all. One of the clearest examples of just how much the island's legal code had remained frozen in an earlier era, even as the rest of Western Europe moved on. Sark's most famous 20th century ruler was Dame Sybil Hathaway, who held the title of seigneur, using the feminine form Dame, from 1927 until her death in 1974. Hathaway became something of a legend for the way she reportedly handled the German occupation of the island during the Second World War, using what admirers described as a combination of old world manners, feudal etiquette, and sheer stubbornness to protect her small population through years of enemy occupation. The 2011 Dark Sky Island designation, the first of its kind anywhere in the world, remains one of Sark's proudest modern distinctions, a direct, unplanned benefit of the very absence of cars and street lighting that has otherwise been described by outsiders as the island simply being behind the times. And the neighboring island of Brecqhou, where the Barclay brothers built their castle, technically falls within Sark's jurisdiction despite the brothers' repeated legal efforts to have it recognized as a separate fief entirely, a dispute that in its own way is just as tied up in questions of feudal precedent and inherited authority as the larger battle over Sark's own government. Sark, today, faces challenges that have little to do with feudalism and everything to do with simply sustaining a community this small. A resident population of 500 to 600 people has to support schools, basic services, and an economy heavily dependent on seasonal tourism, with limited opportunity for the kind of economic diversification larger places take for granted. The island's low-tax status once a quiet historical footnote, has drawn increasing international scrutiny in an era of tightening global tax transparency standards, creating real uncertainty about how sustainable that part of Sark's economic model will remain going forward. The lingering tension from the Barclay brothers' involvement hasn't fully disappeared either. Years of legal conflict, property acquisition, and disputes over the island's post-reform governance left real divisions among residents, between those who welcomed outside investment and modernization, and those who saw it as an unwelcome intrusion on an island that had, whatever its flaws, governed itself on its own terms for over 4 centuries. And there's a deeper, quieter challenge too. Having finally dismantled a system that had defined Sark's identity for 443 years, the island is still, in a real sense, figuring out what comes next, how to remain recognizably itself, distinct from Guernsey and the wider world, without the singular, centuries-old institution that had always set it apart most clearly. Ask residents why they stay on an island this small, this isolated, and until recently, this politically unusual, and the answers consistently circle back to exactly the qualities that made Sark strange in the first place. The total absence of cars and their noise, the extraordinary night skies, a pace of life that has resisted nearly every pressure to modernize, that has reshaped the rest of Western Europe. There's also a genuine, if complicated, pride in Sark's singular history, even among residents who supported the 2008 reforms. Having been part of the very last feudal state in the Western world isn't something most people who live there treat as an embarrassment to move past quickly. It's treated, more often, as a defining feature of what makes this 3-mile-long island different from literally everywhere else in Europe. That pride connects directly to the actual story of how the reform happened, because the full picture of Sark's transition from feudal fiefdom to modern democracy is stranger and more specific than most people who've heard the basic outline realize. It wasn't a popular uprising from within. It was a very particular, very modern collision between old inherited power and new billionaire wealth, playing out through courtrooms rather than revolution. It's time to finally tell you exactly how that collision played out and how it ended. The Barclay brothers' campaign against Sark's feudal system culminated in a series of legal challenges arguing, under the European Convention on Human Rights, that a government composed of unelected hereditary landholders violated the basic democratic rights guaranteed to every resident of a Council of Europe member state. Facing mounting legal and political pressure that Sark's tiny government had neither the resources nor ultimately the legal standing to fully resist, reform became essentially inevitable. In April 2008, Sark held its first fully democratic election in the island's entire recorded history. The old chief pleas, composed of 40 hereditary and land-based tenant seats, was replaced by a body of 28 elected members, chosen by Sark's adult population in a genuine popular vote. The first time in 443 years that political power on this island had been decided by anything other than birthright or land ownership. The seigneur's role didn't disappear entirely. The title remains, held today by the descendants of the same family line, now serving a largely ceremonial function rather than genuine governing authority, along with a fixed annual payment from the island in place of the old feudal dues, an arrangement that can still be passed down through the seigneur's heirs. A small, formal echo of the system that once ran everything. Here's the detail that makes this story more than simply a tale of billionaires versus tradition. The Barclay brothers, despite winning their legal fight and fundamentally reshaping Sark's government, never actually achieved full control over the island themselves. Their attempt to have Breku recognized as an entirely separate fief, independent of Sark's authority, was rejected. What they succeeded in doing wasn't seizing feudal power for themselves. It was simply ending feudal power altogether, whether or not that was ever fully their original intention. 443 years of continuous feudal government on Sark ended not with a revolution from below, but with a legal argument about human rights, brought by two of the richest men in Britain, that neither side could have easily predicted would actually succeed. There's a strange irony sitting at the center of Sark's modern story. The island that resisted nearly every wave of political change sweeping across Europe for 4.5 centuries was finally transformed, not by its own 600 residents rising up, but by outside wealth-wielding modern human rights law as a legal weapon. And yet Sark, in most of the ways that actually define it, remains recognizably itself. No cars, no airport, no streetlights interrupting some of the darkest, clearest skies left in Western Europe. The seigneur's title endures, even stripped of the real power it once carried. Maybe that's the real lesson of a place like Sark, that even the oldest systems eventually give way to something new. But the character of a place, if it's genuine enough, can survive the collapse of the very structure that first defined it. If you find meaning in these forgotten coordinates, consider subscribing to the map. Together, we'll keep rescuing these places from the silence of history.